we go with advanced functions. And Hannah, if you're still on the line, if I do something stupid, please cover for me, correct any mistakes that I make. I know you do some of this a lot more than I do. So if I do take things down the wrong path, or if you've got better advice for people, please feel free to jump in.
Put a phone and watch you flounder.
Sit there and go, All right, so what I'm going to cover today, I know this is advanced, but some people may not be familiar with some of the basic things. So I was going to do a widget function calling a service. We'll do a function that's calling an external REST API. Sometimes you can use that, for example, if you're interfacing with another partner or another service. I wouldn't do this with ADP, but let's say, for example, you needed to get ADP data. You could call their REST API and get that information via your function, for example. We'll also show an example of a function calling another function. You can do that. It does allow for some great code reuse. So instead of writing things multiple times, just like Kevin had pointed out in his code, he reuses a lot of the same code over and over. So he's condensed those down into methods that he can use instead of duplicating those functions or those methods inside of his configurator. So you can do the same type of thing with functions. I'll also show you how to create a method within a function. For example, if you need to do something with recursion, if you're not familiar with what recursion is, it's where you might call the same method over and over to get a result. An easy concept of this with Epicor is, for example, you might have a bill of materials for your finished good. So here's the materials that go into that. You might make some of those materials. So you want to go in and find out, well, what materials go in to make that material, and keep on going for each of those parts that you've got in that bill of materials until you get down to just your purchased parts. So you have to keep doing what's called recursion. Every time you find a part that you make, what are the materials that make that part? And if some of those are made, what makes those? And you keep on going down. And I'll also cover briefly some ways that you can do some logging inside of functions, because there's not much feedback when you're doing a function for, hey, I've got an error or this method is failing. So how do I get that feedback? Or how do I know that my function's working properly? And there's some ways that you can do that, or at least some ways that I found. And there's probably some others. If you've found some other ways to do those, please share them with the group. It gives us all a chance to learn from this. So I'm going to try and back out of my PowerPoint here and bring up Epicor. There we go. Sorry, I changed the resolution on my screen so that hopefully things are a little bit easier instead of being really small. So I'm going to go into Epicor function maintenance. Now I've got that in the recents. If you go to the menu, the easiest way I found is just type function in the search, comes right up. You can also go to system management, business process management, Epicor function maintenance. So those are easy ways to get there. I like that search just because it's easier. And I forgot to hit shift click so that I get a new instance of Epicor functions, because I've got my backup library over here, my Betty Crocker oven, in case things go horribly messy. I can always pull up my samples that I used while writing this this presentation to try and get things going. And if you'll pardon me, I kind of got 3 screens going, so I'm trying to keep track of my notes, my functions, what's going on for chat with any questions that come up. So we're going to create a new library. So I'm going to come over here and do an add library. That lets me type into my library. And for this purpose, I'm just going to call this emug 231116, today's date and time. So we'll call it emug examples. Boy, I can't spell. This was going to be a fun presentation to start with, 11/16/2023. I am, because I'm going to use it later on, I'm going to be using some custom code functions, and I am going to show some database examples of reading and writing. So I'm going to turn those on now. You can turn them on down the road if you need to. So until you actually need them, don't turn them on. That way your code's a little more concise, or your function library is a little more concise. What this does, if you're not familiar with them, custom code widgets. If you're designing a function that's using widgets, there is a widget that allows you to do custom code. There's also a function that is strictly custom code. So that's what this second checkbox lets me do. The DB access from code, that's where, if I'm going to be directly accessing the database, do I want to not allow that, the none? Do I want to only have read-only access, or do I want to allow read-write? And you do get some granular control, and when we get into that example, I'll kind of show that. because if you don't select the granular control, you can also end up with some problems in your function where it doesn't compile and you're trying to write to the database. So we'll kind of go over those things. Now for our purposes, our first example, we're going to write a function that's going to be calling what's known as a service inside of here. So I'm going to go to my references. Now you can use the business objects through the assemblies. I find when you hit the add there, it takes a long time to load. So I'd like to use them through the services instead. So I went to references, services, and I'm going to click add. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to build something that's going to, from an order number, get me the customer ID. Very simple example, but I need to have two services available to me. One, so that I can call my sales order, get my customer number, and then my second one, I'm going to call my customer service to get my customer ID from that customer number. So I'm going to click add here, and that popped up on my other screen. Give me just a second to bring it back over. There we go. Now I'm working with the ERP objects because I'm going to be working with sales order and customer. If you drop this down, you'll notice you can also do the ICE layer if you need those. Okay, I'm going to choose ERP. Now I can choose business objects, simple service, process, or report. Reports, kind of obvious. Process, those are the processes that you can run. For example, I'm not sure if it's in here, but MRP would be an example of a process. Simple service are things that are in the lib namespace. So anything that you find in the lib would be in there. We're going to use a business object, and I'm going to start my search with things that start with sales. I'm going to come down to sales order, click OK, so that gets added. Now to come back, I'm going to add in my customer one, and again, because my main screen's over there, I have to bring this back over. We're going to start searching with cust and go to customer. Double click that, and that gets added. So now I've got my two services that I can use in the entire library. So you kind of want to keep track where you are in things. So I'm on references, services. That means I'm on my entire library. When you go to function, you might find things that are specific to the function down here. So just like in other Epicor areas where you have those tab metaphors, you've got that as well with your libraries. So you want to make sure, is this something that's available to the entire library, or am I doing something specific to my function? So I'm going to go flip over to my function here, my function tab, I should say, and I'm going to create a new function. Now, first, before I do that, I'm going to save my library as it is. Always a good habit to save as you need to. I like my phrase is save early, save often. It kind of helps you in case something does go massively wrong. You've got a backup that you can go to. Now we're going to add a widget function to our library. So I'm going to go add a widget function. Now for function IDs, this is going to be your function name that you would use anywhere you're going to call it. If you're not familiar, functions can be called via the web. So through the REST API, you can call your function. You can call them in BPMs. You can call them through customizations. And by customizations, you can call them in classic customizations. You can call them in kinetic customizations, so Application Studio. And you can also call functions from functions. So your function ID, you want to have it be something that's going to be useful. I also highly, strongly recommend, please do not name functions these default names. If you have a function that contains a special character, for example, this -1, it could be interpreted that that is trying to do math. And so it's trying to find function and then decrement that by 1. So use regular words. Don't use special characters like the minus, underscores, things like that. So I like to name my functions, and I will use what's called camel case, meaning the first letter of each word I'm going to do in uppercase. That way it's easy to read, figure out what I'm doing. So in this case, I'm going to call it get cust ID. Now, if I wanted to, I could say get cust ID from order number. That might be more of a descriptive, might be a better name for that. You kind of want to figure out what is a good naming convention for your functions and stick with that. So whatever you're doing, make sure you're consistent on here. I'm going to go down to my description and just say example to get cust ID from order number. You can put in here whatever you want. I would put something in there. I kind of try to go with the attitude of don't think that you're going to always remember what's happening here. Think about it's 3 years down the road, you need to come in and find this again. You've not worked with it 3 years. Are you going to remember what's there? So descriptions are going to help. Another way to think of that is, what happens if you get that lucky intern that comes in and has to maintain this? You want to try and leave some breadcrumbs for that person so they know what they're dealing with. That's why I like to do some of these things. All right, I'm going to come down. I'm going to go over to my signature. Now, the signature is what tells me my input parameters. In this case, they're called request parameters, and my output parameters. In this case, that's called response parameters. So I can have multiple inputs and multiple output parameters. So if I need to send multiple pieces of information back, I can do that. If I want to accept one or more pieces of information in, I can do that with my request parameters. So I'm just going to click in this grid. It automatically creates me a parameter called input of type string. Now, I'm going to bring in an order ID. Now, I do that as a lower O, upper I, just because variables in C#, that's typically how we name them. So I kind of do something similar here. Totally fine if you want to have uppercase for all of those as well. So I could have done a capital O for order, capital I for ID. But I think it's easier, sticks with more convention if you start with a lowercase letter for your parameters. Now, orders inside of Epicor are integers. So I need to change this type. I'm going to come over to the dropdown and choose a system int 32. That's an integer. Now, if you see this question mark behind a type, that means that it's nullable, meaning it can be not blank, but not provided. So there's no value in there, which is different than having a blank for a string, for example. I'm going to work with the int 32, so I'm just going to choose that value. Now for my output, I'm looking to output the cust ID. So I'm going to type in cust ID. I could have typed customer ID to make it more specific. That actually might be a better thing so that we have something more explicit on here and don't abbreviate stuff. Again, I'm doing the lower C on customer, upper I on ID. And my customer ID is going to be a string. So that's that ID that you type into Epicor, like Dalton, Barrington, those types of things. That's your ID. In Epicor, other than the customer table, everything is stored as cust num, meaning an integer ID. That's what relates back to that customer table. But when we go to look up customers inside of Epicor, we don't know their numbers, we know their IDs. So even if you do use a numeric for your IDs, it's still stored as a string. That's why we use a string here. When I'm done with my signature, I'm going to hit complete over here. That way it kind of locks in my signature. Now I know what my input, my output parameters are. I can always come back and edit this. Now, if you edit your signature, keep in mind you may be breaking whoever's using you. So if I edited this, and just for example, if I changed my order ID to be order identifier, well, now anybody that was calling me and was passing in a parameter order ID, that doesn't match with the order identifier. So I'm going to break them. So you want to be very conscious if you do any changes to your signature, or for example, if you accidentally click down here and it adds input too, you want to make sure you clean those up. It's okay to change your signatures if you need to, especially during development. Once you publish your function, that's the time you want to be very cognizant of, hey, what am I doing if I change this? You might want to create a second function that takes an extra parameter, for example, instead of changing the parameters on your original function. And you can have your new function call your old one, or you can have your old one call your new one, so that you get the same functionality, but you're not breaking anything that's already been released out there. It's just a good habit to get into. I'm now going to click on my design over here, and that's going to let me get into design mode for my function. And again, things are opening up on my main screen, so I'm going to try and drag them over onto the larger screen here so that hopefully you can see them a little bit easier. We're going to invoke a BO method. So I'm just going to drag this guy out, draw my line from my start over to my BO method, and then I want to invoke a specific method. So I click on that. Again, that pops up over here. Joink. You'll notice in this list, when I choose System Code, ERP, Business Object, I only have customer and sales order. So whatever I added in my services, that's what shows up in this service name. So if you ever find, hey, I needed to do purchase orders, boink, and there's nothing in here, or you don't have purchase order in here, that's your clue. Back out of your function designer, go back to your library references and add in a service for that purchase order. That'll get that to appear in this list, okay? It's a common mistake that I've seen people use where they're like, I can't get to my objects. You need to remember to add those references. A lot of times in the earlier versions of Epicor, everything was always available. With functions, they're trying to streamline that down so you're very focused. You can't get to everything. You have to decide what you want to get to. That's why they're doing this. Where my method name starts with, now I'm going to look up my sales order get by ID. So I just start typing the get by, hit search. In my case, I hit enter. That's why you didn't see me click on the search button. And I've got my get by ID. I can just double click on that. And I see I've got a couple questions here from Dan. May go over during the presentation. I wonder if there's any advice for best practices for libraries. More functions, less libraries, fewer functions per library. When do I want to use different libraries? Dan, in general, I would say you want to group your functions by libraries. So if I'm doing something specific to a project or specific to another partner, maybe I've got a set of functions that work with just that partner. So I would probably create a library for just that partner. If I've got functions that I use across other functions, I might make a library called common, and then I could store those in there. An example of a common might be, hey, I'm going to format a date from a date format to a specific string, an ISO string format. So I might store those in a common library that then my other libraries could then reference to use those functions in there. In general, the library is just a way to group those together. So however it's going to make sense for you. I don't think there's a performance hit of having more libraries, more functions, less functions within a library. I don't think there's a performance hit that way. So it really just matters about your organization so that you can maintain these things. And then from Paul, for the first sample method, order ID, customer ID, wouldn't it make sense to include company number as an additional parameter? In our case, Paul, we're not doing companies an ID. It's actually not a number if you're in reference to being like multi-company. So Epic 06 versus Epic 01. The reason I don't include those is because when you call the function, if you're doing it through the REST API, you're specifying the company in there. If you're doing it within Epicor, either through App Studio or through classic customizations or BPMs, you're already within a company. And so it's using the context of the company that you're already in. So you don't have to have that inside of there. But I appreciate the questions. If that didn't answer, Dan and Paul, if those didn't answer your questions, let me know. I'll try and help you out more. Okay, so back to our BO method. I'm calling my get by ID, and I need to pass in some parameters. So in this case, get by ID for an order takes an order num. I can come over to my binding column, drop that down, and I can choose order ID. Now it says var order ID. That var means it's a variable. The order ID is coming from my function definition, that signature definition. So I'm pulling that in from here. Now, the return of a get by ID gets me a sales order table set. Now I need to store that somewhere so that I can use it later. So I don't have a variable defined for it. I could either ignore this or create a new variable. We're going to create a new variable, and I'm just going to call this sales order, order DS for sales order data set. If I wanted to, I could spell out data set here, or I could call it table set. I'm just going to abbreviate DS, make it a little bit easier for me. So that's my input, my output for my BO function, my sales order get by ID. Now from that sales order, I want to get my customer number because I'm going to pass that into my customer get by ID. So I need to come down and set an argument or variable to store my customer number. But I don't have a customer number variable yet. So I'm going to come over to my variables, and I'm going to add a variable by clicking on this button. We're going to call that custnum. I could call it customer number if I wanted to spell everything out. And I'm going to call that as an integer. So my type is integer. Now I'm going to go back to my actions tab, make sure I'm clicking on my set argument variable. I'm going to click on the specified argument. I'm going to set custom to a specified expression. I'm going to click on that expression, go to my sales order DS, which came from my get by ID. I can go to the order head and then come down and get my custom. I'm just double clicking on custom. It fills into the editor. Force a habit, I always click check syntax. Even though I double clicked on the item, it should come in just fine. I like to double check. Syntax is okay, gonna click okay on there. And I realize I forgot to draw my line here. So I'm gonna draw my line from my BO method to my set my argument. Now that I've got a custom variable, I can call my customer get by ID. So I'm actually gonna move this guy over here, just make it a little bit easier. Draw my line from one to the other. We'll put him on top, choink, just make him look good. Now for this business object method, I'm gonna click on my specified BO. Again, that popped up over on my other screen. We're gonna use customer, get by ID. So I just typed in get by, hit enter, which is the same as clicking search up here. Do get by ID and configure my parameters. So I'll click on the not configured. That expects a custom. So I'll come in, choose my variable custom, and then my output is going to be creating a new variable. And this variable name is going to be customer DS or customer data set. Click OK, hit OK on here. So now I've got my business object set. Now what I want to do is I want to actually return my customer ID. So again, I'm going to get my set argument variable. We're just going to draw a line between those two guys. And I try to get it. It's my OCD that these lines have to be perfect and I should just give up. So set the specified argument. And in this case, I want my cust ID, which where did he go? My specified argument. I need a variable for cust ID. Except I should be able to set that to my customer ID down here. That's what I'm looking for. I think I forgot that I changed it from cust ID to customer ID, and that's what's screwing me up. So let me go back to my set argument, specified argument, customer ID. There we go. See what happens when you do live demos and your notes say use this variable name and you decide to be special and say, no, we're going to call it this, and you get lost in yourself. That's what happens. So we're going to set our customer ID, which is our output parameter, our response parameter. And I'm going to set it to the specified expression. This time I'm going to go to my customer data set, expand that, go to my customer table, and I'm looking for the cust ID value. Just double clicking, it appears over in the editor there. Check syntax, it's okay, click OK here. And then I'm going to validate. Make sure it comes back and says workflow succeeded, no issues were found. If there were errors here, they would show up over here so that you could correct your workflow and figure out what's wrong. Now I'm going to save my function and then close. And I'm going to save my library at this point. You want to make sure you save your library so that all of those code changes actually go into effect before you go to test them. So now I'm going to use a tool called PostMan. I've already got him up over here. And with PostMan, I can do REST calls. And with Epicor functions, you can very easily, your functions are automatically exposed via the REST API unless you tell them to be internal only, and then they're not shown via the REST API. So I'm going to add a request here. Now, functions are always post functions, so I need to change this to a post. I'm going to grab my URL that I had for my other testing library. My Betty Crocker is over here in case we have something wrong. Now, the question was, how do I know what company my function's working against? Well, in this URL, I'm using variables. Postman lets me use variables for things. So I've specified my app server, it's a variable, the instance I'm working with. The URL then includes API version 2, EFX for Epicor function. Staging lets me get to libraries that have not been published. So I can test my libraries before I publish them out. Once you publish a library, you can't make changes to it until you unpublish the library. So you kind of want to publish when everything's all good, and then don't make changes unless you absolutely have to. And the question had come up, how come I don't put company inside of my function parameters? And that's because part of the URL includes what company you want this to work against. So it's automatically in here. I don't have to specify it inside my function. Then I need my library name. Now my Betty Crocker there was FZ test. Our library, just so that I don't screw it up, because I know I will, I'm going to go to my library here, copy the name of my library, come back here and paste that in. So emug 231116, and then finally the name of my function. And this is where I need to make sure I didn't do something stupid and call my function something else. Nope, I called it getCustID, so we match with that. Okay, now I'm going to save my new request. I've noticed sometimes in Postman, if you don't save things, they actually don't come back. And I just noticed that I had my bullet there. That's why we had the little circle with the tab. So I just hit backspace to make sure that I clean out those special characters. Otherwise, my URL is not valid. Now I'm going to go to my body here, and I need to say that I'm using JSON. And then inside my body is where I put in my variable that I had. So this is going to be my request parameters. So we called it order ID. I'm going to copy that name. And because it's JSON, I'm going to put that request parameter inside of quotes, do a colon, and then give an order ID number. So let's put in 5423, which is an order from Dalton inside the test system. When I hit send, I missed my API key. Of course I was going to miss something. So give me a second here. I'm going to go to one of my Betty Crocker ones, and I'm going to grab I'm going to grab this variable because I need to remember to pass in my API key here. API key, there we go. Save that guy. So because I'm using version 2 to get to the functions, everything needs to have an API key so that it's validated. So that's why I forgot to include it, because I was doing my first one. From here on out, I'll be copying these guys. I'm also going to name this, this was getCustID example. That way we can tell them apart. So now I'm going to hit send. Now I get my customer ID back of Dalton. If I change my body, instead of order 5423, if I do 5420, that should come back as Barristan. Choink. So very easy to put a function together just using the widgets. So you can do some advanced things that would normally you would be like, oh, I have to join this and this and this to get to there. You can actually do all that joining that you would do like in a PAQ. You can just call the various business object methods to get the data that you need, fill in your variables appropriately, and then send your output back out. All right, so that was a very kind of simple advanced item of how to do a function with widgets and how to call it with Postman so that we can test things.
You have another question.
So now we're going to do a test. I'm sorry?
You have another question out there?
Can I talk about variables in Postman? Oh, sorry, John. Sure. So variables, that's what these double curly braces app server, for example, is a variable. I can define those as environments. So if I'm going to be testing against multiple servers, I could have different environments and then define these variables. I would have them the same across environments. So for example, let me go to my environments over here. I'll go to my Kinetic 2023. I've coded in my app server, my instance, my API key so that I can use it, a username, password, and the default company that I'm working with. What's nice about this is over here in Postman, I've got a drop down and I can change what environment I want to hit against. So I could define, let's say, for example, I was going to hit my other environment. Oops, actually, let me keep this the same because I don't want to screw that up. If I went to my other environment, you see I could have a different server, different instance, different API key. And so when I'm testing inside of my collection, I can easily change from hitting my 2023 server to my 2022 server or 10 dot whatever server just by doing this drop down, and those variables would already be encoded so that I don't have to remember and retype them every time. So it helps me when I'm testing things out to do that. Let me know if that doesn't help you, John, and we can go into more detail there. All right, I'm going to minimize PostMan, and we're going to create our second function, which was a function calling an external REST API. Now, of course, I was stupid. I should have read my notes, which said, hey, make sure you test this REST API so people understand what we're trying to do here. So I wrote a quick down and dirty web service. Hopefully I've got this highlighted. And I'm going to add a request. And this one's going to be a GET request. So I just created on my app server a directory called Web API that has a method called add days to it. It takes a date and a number of days. And if I send that, it just goes out and adds, hey, 14 days to May 1st is going to be May 15th. If I wanted to add, let's do 10/21 and I add 14 days, you'll notice it changes the month as well. So this was just a simple thing. It's purely, is this valuable? Probably not, but it's going to help us illustrate how do I have a function that's calling another function, or a function that's calling a REST API. So I'm just going to call this API example so it doesn't end up sitting there as new request. That always just bugs me. Sometimes I've got my OCD. So now we're going to go back to functions, and I'm going to create a function to call this. Now, in order to do this, this is going to be a custom code function. It's just going to make it easier if I do it all through custom code. Now, in order to call that REST API, I'm going to need a couple other libraries. I'm going to need a library called REST Sharp, which Epicor ships with. That's going to let me do my web call. I'm also going to do a reference to a library called newtonsoft.json, and that handles JSON objects coming back and forth. So being able to send JSON and receive JSON as a response. And again, JSON, if you want to know, let's go back to our get cust ID on our body. We did these curly braces, and then we had a parameter inside of quotes, colon, and a value. That's JSON. So that's a common way to do REST API calls, is through JSON to pass those values back and forth. So that's why I want to add that in. So I'm going to go to references. Now this time I am going to go to assemblies and hit add, and I probably should have started that soliloquy that I just did, because as you'll notice here, it's loading assemblies in, and it takes a while for it to get through all the assemblies that are over on the server. So if you're looking for something in particular, I'm looking for REST Sharp. So I started typing REST. Notice it still hasn't shown up yet. Just be patient. Hey, look, there we go. It's because it's still reading those libraries in there. So I want to use REST Sharp, and it's using version 106.13.0.0 of this library. I'm going to click OK. Then I'm going to add. Now, once it's loaded those in, usually it loads them, it caches that. So once you waited for that to load, the second time you bring it up, it's probably faster. And I'm going to look for Newtonsoft, newtonsoft.json. Just going to double click, that adds that library. So now I've got references to those, and I can use them inside of my code. So now I'm going to save my library, do a new custom code function. And for this one, I'm going to call it test add days. And it's testing the add days API. Okay, nothing tricky about this guy. I'm going to create my signature down here. We're going to have a date come in. I'm going to choose that. Oops, I got to scroll up here. That has to be a date time. Notice, because of the question, that means it can be nullable, meaning there's no value in that date. And then my response parameter, I'm going to leave it as output. I'm going to try and follow my notes this time. And I'm going to scroll up and make sure that that type is also update time. And I forgot, didn't follow my notes too closely, did I? I need a number of days to add, and that's going to be an integer. Sorry. Usually I do all my requests together and then my response, but my eyes got shifted when I'm looking back and forth between 3 screens here. I'm going to click complete. That completes my signature. Again, I can always come back and edit if I need to. So I've got a date and a days up here. So now let's go to our code. Now, because this is custom code only, notice I don't have a design button. I have an edit button because all you can do is edit the code. So when I click edit, yay, that guy popped up over here. So I'm going to edit my code. Now, because I'm using that ResSharp and that NewtonSoft, I'm going to come over to the Usings tab over here, and I'm going to add those guys in. So I'm going to add in using ResSharp and using NewtonSoft.json. Check my syntax, make sure I'm okay, just in case I put them in the wrong spot. Go back over to my code. And what that using does is those are in what's called namespaces. So instead of having to type ResSharp.ResClient, blah, 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 I can just type ResClient. Instead of typing JSON convert, for example, instead of typing NewtonSoft.json.json convert, I can just type JSON convert. So the usings let me shortcut those namespaces. Now, the first thing I want to do is I need to know what URL I'm going to hit. And for my purposes, just so that I don't screw this up, because we know I will, I'll come in, no, you know what, we got time. We'll say var URL. So I'm declaring a variable called URL, and I'm going to use what's called string interpolation. That's what this $sign means. Then I'm doing a quote, and I'll show you what that dollar means in the long run here. Just hold on a second. We're going to go to http://dev20232/web API/add days question date equals, and then I'm going to put in a placeholder, my curly braces, ampersand days equal, and then another placeholder, close my quote, semicolon. So in string interpolation, you may be familiar with string.format, and you would have 0 and 1, and then you'd have to specify the arguments. With this $sign, I can actually put the variables straight in here. So I don't have to use the 0, the 1, the 2, the 3, the 4. I can actually put in my variables here. Now, I want to use my variable from that I defined as my request parameters. So I can come over to my request scope. Now, I want to make sure I'm in my date placeholder here. So date equals curly brace, I'm right in there. I can double click date and it fills this in. Now, again, I'm OCD, so I don't like those spaces around there. So I'm going to get rid of those. Now, my date, I want formatted a specific way. And to do that with string interpolation, I'm going to do a colon mm/dd/YYYY. That's for month /day/year. And that's matching up. How do I know what I need to do? Because of my API example over here, that's what my format was. Okay, yes, I also wrote the function. I know what format I'm needing. So that's how I'm getting these things in the right format. Now for my days, I'm going to come over, double click days, it put it in there. And again, it doesn't hurt. I'm just getting rid of those extra spaces because I don't like seeing them. So that gets me my URL. Now I need my client. So I'm going to say var client, that declares our client, and it's going to be a new REST client, open paren, URL, close paren, semicolon. So this REST client comes from that ResSharp library that we had. By passing in the URL, that's the URL we defined up here, so that's the URL it's going to hit for our client. I'm going to say client.timeout is equal to -1, so it doesn't time out on us. And then I need the request back from that. So that's going to be a new REST request, open paren, method.get. So in our case, this specific API that we're calling is a get instead of a post. You saw when we did the Epicor testing function, it was a post. In the API that I wrote, I made it a get. You can change this if you're ever doing a post, method.post. For this purposes, it's going to be a get. Then I need my response back, and that's going to be equal to client.execute of the request. Now, the response comes back. I'm going to go back to my PostMan so that you can see. It comes back as a string down here, and that's kind of an ISO formatted string. It's year, month, day, T, and then hours, minutes, seconds. So I need to be able to handle that and get it back into a regular date. So in order to parse that, that's actually coming back as a JSON string. So I'm going to use a temporary variable. I'm going to call it temp date is equal to, and I'm going to use a class called JSON convert, which comes from that Newtonsoft library. And I can say deserialize object, and I'm going to convert it to a date time. This helps if you put the E on time. This less than and greater than JSON or JSON convert that serialize object is a generic, and you specify what type you're looking to have come back. In our case, we want a date time, so you put that inside the less than greater than. If I wanted a string, I could put that in instead, or an int or something like that. And then I need to specify what I'm converting, which is going to be my response.content. Apparently I can't spell today. Response.content is for my response variable here. Content is the body of that response message. So that string that we got back with the date, that's what we're getting back. Now I want to set my output, my response, equal to that temp date. And something I did when I was testing, but I didn't do in this, I could also, I had a second parameter that was just some testing that I did so that I could find out what was going on. So what I'm going to do, I'm actually going to do this on the fly. This will be fun. It'll probably blow up on me, but that's okay. I'm going to come in and edit this and put in a variable called other and leave it as a string. And then edit my test days again. And this way I can come in and say other is equal to, and again, I'll use string interpolation, content is equal to response.content. That this means a new line and a carriage return. Status code is equal to response.statuscode. And my URL is equal to my URL. Close my quote, semicolon. This way, I've got another parameter that I can send back some messages on. This is useful for testing. So if you're trying to figure out what the heck is happening, for example, if I don't know what all is going on in the response, this is a good way to see what's coming back on that if the rest of your function isn't working right. So similar to logging, I'm just getting it all through the output parameter. Also to note, when I double clicked, it said this dot other. The this dot is actually optional. So in this case, just to illustrate it, I'm going to remove the this dot from my other. I'll leave it for the output. I'm going to do check syntax. I did click it, didn't I? Oh, welcome to the fun. Sometimes when you're doing functions, this area down here will either get hidden, so you have to remember to come down and scroll it up, or if you drag a function editor from one window to one screen to another, you might lose your code, in which case you have to grab it from the top and drag it down. Just be aware of that. Okay, so this says the name response does not exist. So I misspelled response somewhere, R-E-S-R-E-S-P-O-N-S-E. Let's check syntax again. Now we're good, huzzah. Well, oops, I hit spacebar while I had that button highlighted. So we'll hit OK here, save my method, come back over to my PostMan. Now I'm going to duplicate my cust ID so that I don't have to remember to do my API key, because I'll probably forget it again. I'm going to drop this guy down here. Since he's our third example, we're going to rename him to, this is my external API, just so I know what I'm doing. Now I'm going to come back to my function, and I'm going to grab my function name, test add days. I'm going to replace my get cust ID with test add days. Everything else along here stays the same. Still the same app server instance, still the same company, still the same library. It's just the function name that I'm changing. Now, in this case, we need to do our body as our two methods here. So I'm going to come back here. We've got a date and a days. So I'm going to change my order ID to date and then do a comma, quote, days, close my quote, colon. Let's say, because I'm doing a date, that has to be in quotes. So I'm going to say 11/16/2023, and let's add 10 days to that. So I'll send that, boom. 10 days added on to the 16th is the 26th. And down here, you'll see I've got my content is this backslash quote is a way to say that it's really quoted. So I'm really getting back this string, the 2326, my status code is okay. Here's the URL that I was hitting. If I change this, for example, to the 26th, let's add 15 days, run it, now it's 12/11. So it's a nice way to get my output back so I know what's going on. When I publish the function, I'd probably get rid of this other down here just to keep things clean so that when somebody else goes to use my function, they're not like, what's this other mean? And then I have to try and explain to them, hey, it's what I was using for testing. You can ignore it. If I just take that away, they know the only thing they can work with is the output. So it helps them out. So you do want to clean up after yourself as you go. Just makes things a little bit easier. All right. Now we're going to do a function calling a function. So I'm going to minimize PostMan here, come back over to my functions. And again, I'm going to use a widget function to do this. So I'm going to add a widget function. I'm going to call this guy test add months. He's going to take in a date, which will be a date time. And what I'm going to do with this, just so I don't think I put in here exactly what I was doing, we're going to call our other function, our test add days, and then we're going to add months to it. So we're just doing one function calling another function. Whoops, and I clicked on too many things there. So now I've got an input 3 and an input 4 that I need to fix up to months. That's going to be an integer. And I need to get rid of my input 4. So sometimes it's easier to work with this fully expanded or maximized so that you can see all your parameters and you don't end up with an accidental one sitting down here. Now for our output, we're going to call this output, and it's going to be a date time. Choose the right type there. Go ahead and hit complete, and then we'll go into design, which opens up on another window, and we got to remember to bring it back over here. So we're going to invoke a function inside of our new function. So I'm going to go for my start, invoke my function, and I need to come down here and configure these underlined items. So my library is going to be my current library. If I had other libraries, I could choose them inside of here. So I'm going to choose my current library. I'm going to choose my test add days, and then I need to set its parameters. So test add days takes a date. That can be the date that we have on our function. Our days is in there. Our output, we don't have anything defined for that, so we can actually put it in our output variable. And our other, I'm going to create a new variable called other, just so that I've got that for my test add days function. Okay, so this is going to add in my days. And I think if I'm actually I thought there was a way I could double click right here and then say test add days. So I can even rename my widget so that I know what I'm doing here. Now, once I've added my days, I want to add months. So I'm going to actually come down here and do a set argument variable and go from my function to my argument variable. And we're going to set our output equal to an expression. And our expression is going to be output dot add months. And just a minute, I'll explain why I needed to do value first. And then I'm going to double click on months there. Okay, so because output can be nullable, that's that question mark, I can't get the date right off of that. I have to do dot value to get to the date value of the output, okay? And then there's a method on date time types called add months. And I'm just going to add in whatever months we passed in from our function. That's what all's going on here. Hit check syntax, everything's good, click OK, click validate, workflow succeeded, click save, close this guy, save my library. All right, and I'm going to come up over to my Postman, and I'm going to duplicate, need to make sure I save that, duplicate this call. We're going to call this our test add months and days. Okay, so in this case, our body has our date and our days. We also need a month. And let's add 3 months to it. So previously, 11/26, we got 12/11. So if I add 3 months to that, that should be March 11th. And somehow I screwed up because I got 12/11 back, didn't I? What did I screw up? Live demos, they're always fun. Come back over here, got to get my design. Add months. Did I not do my months correctly? Months. Okay. Did I? Oh, you know what? It's because I'm still on test add days. Live demos, they're always fun. So I'm going to grab my method from my function, come back over here, test add months. I'm going to save this guy. Now when I call it, I get March 11th. And again, we don't get our output string of other because test add months, our function, doesn't have that in it. So over here, our response is just the output. So even though I'm calling another function that had a second output, doesn't mean I have to include it in my response. I can choose to just throw it away if I want to. So you can do whatever you want with those guys. You don't have to return everything that you used along the pathway. And Heather, thanks Heather. Yeah, problematic demos, you always learn more. So you see the common screw-ups that anybody can do, including me, and you learn how to fix them, right? Perfect demos are never fun because then you don't learn what happens when you screw up. So yeah, there are some benefits to this. Okay. Now we want to create a method inside of a function. So in this case, for example, if I were going to do recursion, and what I'm going to do for my recursion, if you're familiar with a math term called factorial, and Kevin's got a statement, you can't use other functions from the current library in 10.2.700, correct. That is in Kinetic only. I'm not sure if it's in the first version of Kinetic onward, or if it's in I'm using 2023, and I believe last year's versions of Kinetic also allowed it. So you might need to double check. It used to be you could only call functions that were in other libraries. They updated that so that you could call functions within your own library, which is very, very powerful. Makes things a lot easier too. All right. Where is I going? Factorials. Okay. So a factorial, what that is in math terms is, let's say I was doing 3 factorial. 3 factorial is actually 3 times 2 times 1. So you always just, it's the current number you're on times that number less 1 until you're down to 1. So 4 factorial would be 4 times 3 times 2 times 1, so on and so forth. So we're going to kind of mimic that. Is it useful in Epicor? Probably not, but it gets us where we need to go, shows you the concepts. You could use something like this for querying the database to build your entire BOM, for example, things like that. So I'm going to add in a custom code function. And I'm going to call this guy method in function. Illustrates a method in a function. That way you can get an idea how to do this guy. Now, for this, I'm going to have an input parameter called start, and that's going to be an integer. And then my output, if I remember correctly, is also going to be an integer. I'm going to leave it called output and make it an integer, complete my signature there. Go to my edit, where I can edit the code. Yeah, I've got both my windows here. And then what I need to do is I need to declare my factorial function. So in order to do that, we're going to use a .NET generic called func. And I can then tell it what is the output type of this function that I'm declaring and what's the input type. And there are other versions of this that take other parameters. So you can have 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 parameters and still create this function. Now I'm going to call my function name factorial and then set it equal to null. And the reason I need to set it equal to null is because I kind of need to declare the variable before I can declare the function that is this variable. I know that sounds odd, but it's kind of how things work inside of .NET. So in this case, I'm going to define what my function really is. Okay, this factorial, I'm going to reassign it, and I'm going to say it takes a variable called _start, and then I'm going to declare what this method actually is. That's what this equal greater than means, is basically, hey, here's what the function really is. It's also known as anonymous methods. If you use Linq, you run into this quite a bit, where you can declare methods for doing other things. So in this case, I'm going to say if my start is equal to 1, then I'm going to return 1. Otherwise, or else, I'm going to return my value times factorial of start minus 1. Close my paren, semicolon. So this is what's getting me my function for a factorial. So if I were 1, if I passed in a value of 1, it would return 1. If I pass in a value of 2, I'd be down here. I'd be 2 times factorial of 2 minus 1, which would be 1. So then it'd be 2 times 1. If it were 3, it'd be 3 times 2, and then that 2 would be 2 times 1. So it keeps on recursing like that. Now I can say output is equal to factorial of start. Now, output is my output variable over here, my response parameter. Start is my request parameter, my start up here. And it helps if you spell factorial properly. I just noticed that I didn't. There we go. Otherwise, I'd get a compile error. And I'll hit check syntax. Missed a semicolon. Good job. Live demos. Check syntax. I'm still missing a semicolon. Forgot it right there. There we go. So this guy should work properly. Now, just as an example, if I didn't do this declare to start with and try to declare the function right from the get-go, when I hit check syntax, I'm going to get this use of unassigned local variable factorial. That's because I'm trying to define it, declare it, and do all sorts of stuff at the same time. And .NET inside of a function just isn't happy with that. So that's why you take away the declaration and put it on a separate line. Do your declare here, set it to null, and then right below it, define that function. That's all you have to do, and then that clears things up. So I'll hit check syntax again, make sure I'm good. I didn't accidentally delete something bad. Click OK, click save on my library. And now I can test doing this if I'm really good, because whoops, that's my PowerPoint. That's a clock. Let's go here, duplicate our critter. This guy is going to be called factorial. I have to remember to change my method name or we're not going to get the right things here. So that's method in function, paste method in function, and then our body is just a start. Let's do something easy, 3. And then I don't need those other parameters because we only have a start coming in. So I'll hit save, hit send, which I get 6 back, 3 times 2 times 1. If I did 9, this is kind of funky with factorials, I get 36, 2, 88, 0. If I do 10, it should be this number times 10. So I'd expect to see the same number, but 2 zeros on the end. Well, it helps if you do 10 instead of 19, doesn't it? Otherwise, your example just doesn't work for anything. There we go. So I've got 36,288,00 for 10, because 10 times what I would have gotten for 9 would be an extra 0 on the end. So I can prove that my factorial function's working properly. So anytime you need to do some extra math or extra validation or something along those lines, you can do that by declaring a function within, or a method within your function. So you do have that power so that you can do these things. Trying to do recursion with a method or a function calling another function, or a function calling itself over and over, that doesn't work. This is how you get around doing the recursion, is you have to put it inside of the function you're in. You can't have a function call itself this way. At least not that I know of. All right, any questions on that so far? I'm actually kind of booking through all my examples. Our last one will probably be ending up a little bit early here. So the last thing I wanted to go over was how to do some logging, or how to do some tracing for functions, because sometimes you might have an error. It compiles perfectly fine, but when you're running, it's like, what happened? For example, if I didn't have this start -1, if I did a start -2, oops, I'm trying to edit the read only there. This will never work. And just so it doesn't screw up, less than or equal to 1. If I accidentally did this as start -11, for example, check syntax totally works, right? Hit OK, hit save. And then when I go to call my method, you'll notice I only get 9. I passed in 9, I only got 9. What the heck? And what's going to be funky is if I pass in 33, this will be a little bit bigger number, but still not as big as I would have expected from 33 factorial. So I don't really have a way to debug that other than looking through here and going, oh, oops, I needed this to actually be a 1 instead of -11. So I accidentally hit the 1 multiple times. So you might find that you need some sort of logging to figure out what all's going on in here. And I just want to make sure my function's back to where it was. Joink. I got a negative. I did save this, didn't I? I shouldn't be getting a negative number. Ooh, I do. Welcome to live demos. What did I screw up? 6 works fine. 4. Okay, somewhere along the way, I'm wondering if 33 is returning too big of a number for an integer. Oops, helps if you do 33 and not 3, because I shouldn't be getting a negative number off of 33. So somewhere in here, something's happening that I'd have to debug further and figure out what else going on there. Hey, which is where logging might come in handy. So one way to do logging is you could actually write to the file system. Now you can't do this in the cloud, obviously, because you can't get to the file system. But if you're on-prem, if you manage your server, you can do something where you could actually log inside of your function. So for example, if I do a new custom code function, let's call this logging, signature, I'm just gonna put in message. It's going to be this, and this one's completely on the fly. So watch this flounder amazingly great. I'm going to come in here and I'm going to say using, and I'll tell you why in just a second. If you'll just bear with me, I'll get some code out. Put is equal to a new, whoops, forgot my equal sign, new stream writer, 2232 share test underscore date time dot now. Got a quote, quote, close my paren on my using, and then we'll do output.write line of message. Okay, so if you spell output correctly, there we go. So what I'm doing here is I'm declaring a stream writer, and I'm giving it a path. Now the @ symbol here tells it, hey, all the backslashes are really backslashes. Normally, if you did like /R, it's carried return /N, the new line. If you do an @ backslash really means backslash. So in this case, I'm getting a UNC path to a share on my server. And just so that I'm not lying here, here's my share, completely empty. I'm giving it a name of text _, and then I'm using that string interpolation again in those curly braces, and I'm saying, get the current date time formatted as year, month, day, _ hours as 24 hours, minutes, seconds. That way I get a unique text file name. Then I'm going to output a here, and then I'm going to output my message. Assuming I've done this all well, oh, of course, because I did this backwards, didn't I? Streamwriter. Okay. You just don't like me, so we'll go through and do double backslashes everywhere. Because when I tested this, I tested it in another tool. I didn't test it in a function, so of course, I end up with problems. Teams price, oh yes. System.io, because I didn't put that in. So if I would have done a using statement for system.io, I wouldn't have to do this system.io.streamwriter. I could just do streamwriter. All right, so in theory, my code works. Let's see what we've got here. I need to complete my signature, save, and this is where you're gonna watch the world blow up and see me crash on my face because I did this a different way. We're gonna call this logging test. I'm gonna come back over to my function, make sure I grab my method name, and then my method has a message, right? I wanna make sure I get that property typed correctly. I did, and whoops, go back over to here. Fred's test message, there we go. Let's send that. I don't get anything back because I didn't have an output parameter. But if I go to my share, my test text file got created. You'll notice it's year, month, day, _ hour, minute, second. I double click this, and wherever Notepad ended up, hello, Notepad, oh, you're over here. He's hidden behind a whole bunch of stuff. There we go. So I've got here Fred's test message. If I went back to PostMan, Fred's second test message, send, go to my share, I should have a second file with a different date timestamp, open it, Fred's second test message. So that's a way that you can do that, assuming that you're on-prem and you have permissions to a UNC path somewhere that you can create these files. Now the danger of this, make sure you go in and fix up your files when you're done. Otherwise you're gonna end up with hundreds and hundreds of files out here, and whoever's running backups on your system might get a little torqued at you that you're doing that. So you just wanna be aware of doing those, cleaning up after yourself. Now another way to do logging such as this, and I don't have this as a complete example, I'm just gonna give you code snippets because I didn't work this all the way through. You can make use of your UD tables. So like UD01, UD02, you can actually write to those UD tables. This would work in the cloud, okay? So I'm just gonna copy and paste some code here. So in this example, I'm trying to write to UD01. One thing you might wanna do is clean out all your old logs. So in this case, if you're gonna write to those UD tables, you wanna figure out what your keys are going to be. So for example, you might want your key 1 to be your library, key 2 to be your function name, key 3 to be your date time. Those keys are all strings, and you've got 5 keys, if I remember correctly, on the UD tables. So you can do up to 5 keys in here. Then when you do that, I'm just doing a delete to get rid of those items. So here's how you could clean out your old items. Now granted, I'm looking for key 3 where the time is the same. I'd probably take this off if I were going to do the delete. In fact, I probably should, and move that into another spot. If I were gonna update, I could find using those keys, and here I'm using the DB object to get to that UD01, and I could update the values and then hit save changes. You can also call an insert and insert a row into UDO1, and that way you could have a contiguous log. From there, you could write a BAQ that says, get me all the information out of UDO1, and maybe do a date range or something on it so that you can filter that to specifically what you're looking for. So that's a way that you could log even if you're in the cloud. Now the caveat with this, notice I'm using the DB object. That's my database, where I can read and write to my database. Now I told my library I want to be able to read and write to the database, correct? So if I do a check syntax, you'll notice, hey, DB doesn't exist in the current context. What the heck? It should, right? So I'm going to go ahead and still close my code. I need to go to my references, and wherever I'm doing a table that I'm going to update in this library. So going back to the person who asked how many functions do I want inside of a library, you might want a library that only deals with certain tables. So instead of having one huge library where you could write to order header and order detail and purchase orders and I don't know what all else, maybe you want to create your library as here's what has to do with sales orders. Here's what has to do with POs is a different library. Here's what has to do with pack slips is a third library. That way you're not exposing a whole bunch of tables and somebody accidentally in the sales order writes to a pack slip. That might not be a good idea. So the key when you're going to go reading and writing from the database, you need to go to your references, tables, and add in the tables that you're going to be working with. So I'm going to come over here. Again, this opened up on the other spot. I want UDO1. So I'm just typing UD, hit enter, which is the same as search. Double click on UDO1. That appears in here. So now I should be able to work with that UD item in here. So I'm going to go over to my function, hit edit, hit check syntax. Oh, wait a minute. I got rid of my DB dot problems, but now it says library context doesn't contain a definition for save changes or delete object. Okay, that is because when I added my table, by default, your tables are read-only. So even though on my library, I'm going to hit OK here so I can go fix this and say, yes, I still want to close my code editor. So on my library, I said my DB access is both read and write. That's not by default. By default, when you go to references tables, these are read-only. Go all the way over to the right. Check that box for updatable. Now if I go to my function, check syntax, syntax is okay. So Epicor is doing a great job of saying, hey, by default, you can read from stuff. Writing, you really want to think about what you're going to do before you write directly to the database because you can cause problems. You want to be careful about this. It's not as dangerous as if you're doing direct SQL. It's a level down, but you're pretty close. You can do damage if you're doing the wrong things. UDO1, UDO2, UDO3, those are pretty easy to write to without a problem. Doing sales orders, I wouldn't choose to directly insert a sales order. I would call the business object so that you get all the business rules defined in that. But if I were going to update, for example, what would be a good one? If I were going to update some comment text, that I'd be okay doing with the DB object. If I were going to update a quantity, that's going to affect a price. So again, I probably want to use the business object so that my pricing, my discount, all the price rules take effect. So be careful when you're doing this that you're not just going, ooh, I can write to the database. Yes, you can. Be careful. So back to what I was saying, Epicor is trying to guard you from doing those mistakes. So that's why they, by default, even if you say my library allows read-write of the database, I have to specifically say which tables I'm writing to, and only those tables can be written to with your custom code. That's a nice guard. Although it's a pain when you're doing your check syntax and you're like, oh, I forgot this. It's a nice guard to keep you from accidentally doing something that you didn't intend to. So although it's a pain, I actually like that it's in there. So this gives you an idea of how to do some logging with your UD tables. So if you're cloud-based, this is a way that you could go through and do that. And what you could do is inside of your function, keep track of, okay, I made it to this point, I made it to this point, I made it to this point. If you wanted, You could even use a string builder in here. So var sb is equal to a new, new system.text.string builder. And then you can just say sb.append line my message. And then you can have a continuous track of what you're doing. And then at the end, just write the sb and the sb.toString. You'd write that to your UD table field. And then you have a full trace of what all happened. So that's another way to do those things. So you do have abilities to do that. From Tim, are you able to write to the event log? In theory, Tim, I think you could. I wouldn't do it. Actually, I think I ran into a posting on Epi Users when I was researching this. No, you can't write to event log, especially on cloud. You might be able to do it on premise. Hannah, do you have an answer that's more specific? Uh-oh, I lost Hannah. There you are.
I jumped back. What was the question?
Writing to event log from a function. I think you can do it on-prem, but I know you can't in cloud.
The cloud would be a problem because I don't think you have access to see the event log.
Correct.
I believe on Epi Users, Kevin Klinscombe has some weird voodoo magic he does to retrieve those, but I'm not positive.
Okay, so you could do it, Tim. If you're on-prem, you'd be okay. If you're in cloud, I'd really avoid it, because even if you can do it right now, it might be more of a problem. From Kevin Veldman, he does say you can write to the system agent task logs. And he also refers to the Kevin Lincombe voodoo magic, and he does it well. So I'll see if I can find a link for that and include that in the minutes for you, Tim. Other questions or comments? I guess while I'm waiting for any others, I'll jump back to my PowerPoint, maybe. One thing I didn't show you is doing your development inside of another tool. So I actually like to use a tool called LinqPad. It's quite awesome for doing things like this. So let me bring my LinqPad over here. So if you're trying to do something inside of a function, a lot of times you can put it inside of LinqPad, get it working, and then go paste it into an Epicor function. So this is a good way to test things and figure out, are they working or not? It's a very easy environment to work with. Do little snippets like this very quickly. Otherwise, you can also use Visual Studio. It's just sometimes working with Visual Studio, you're working with a larger tool, it takes a little bit longer to get up there. But working with a tool like Visual Studio or LinqPad, you can also do Intellisense, which is a godsend, as you can see with the typos that I do. You can also do debugging a little bit easier. So inside of LinqPad, there's a nice little thing, console.writeLine, and you can actually pass it a JSON object, and it'll iterate over that whole object, and you'll see everything that comes back. If you're working with that REST client, you can see everything that comes back in that response content. You get all the status codes, everything that's in there. So that makes things a little bit easier when you're like, well, what property do I need on this? You can find them even if you can't find the right documentation using a tool like LinqPad or Studio. Another tip, try to make things reusable, like Kevin Veldman had pointed out. Look where you can pull something out that you're going to use multiple times, put it in a common library and let all your other functions use that. That way, if you find there's a problem, hey, I've got a problem in how I calculate volume. I forgot to account for cones or something like that. You can fix that up inside of the function, and then everybody that's using that function is now fixed. Versus, where all did I use my volume function? Oh my gosh, I got to go remember to fix up these 20 spots. So reusability is a great thing that you have with functions. Take use of it. And then I'm also an advocate of when you're doing your functions, even if they haven't been published, test them in PostMan. Make sure they're working right. Make sure you're getting the result back that you want. Your output parameters make sense. You got the right output parameters coming out, because then it makes sense when you go and you publish them. If other functions are going to be using your function or something else is going to be using, you already know how that's going to be set up there. It looks like I've got a couple things. Oops. Apparently I forgot a couple things. Publish when ready and export as solutions. And there is a thing when you export your solutions to remember to make them editable. I think by default, When you get to that publish, or not a publish, when you get to build your solution, there's a list or drop down on the right-hand side that tells you what you can do with your functions. By default, they're read-only when you go to import your solution. If you want to be able to edit them when you push them up to your prod, you need to choose that drop down and make sure that they're editable. Okay, let me see what I got for questions here. Okay, so can functions be migrated from E10 to Kinetic properly, or do they need any adjustments? That's from Gerardo. They should just go fine, Gerardo. Again, the caveat being, if you're doing custom code, you could possibly run into some issues if you're calling business objects inside of custom code, if Epicor made changes to those business object signatures. It doesn't happen often, but I've had it happen where a method goes from taking 4 parameters, I kid you not, it went from taking 4 to 14. And they didn't put the extra 10 at the end, they scattered them in the middle. So you had to go and find out what you had to add in. So be aware of those. If you're using the widgets should migrate without a problem. Again, other than the custom code widget, you might have to test that. That said, always good to test your functions. If you go to do an upgrade, always retest everything. Don't assume it makes it, because what happens is you go live, somebody hits that function that you thought nobody used, and you find out there's a problem and you have to scramble to fix it. So do as much testing as you can before you upgrade, but you shouldn't run into problems for the most part. I would say 98+% of everything will make it up without a problem. Have I gotten LinqPad to use a BO call? That's from Nick. I haven't done LinqPad making business object calls. If anything, I would be trying to use the services, the REST services from Epicor, just because the REST services are a little more resilient than the business objects. That I know you can do. When I want to use the business objects, I usually flip over to Studio, just because it's got a little bit better, I can compile things and find out, oh, I'm missing this library, this library, this library. So I usually deal with business objects inside of Studio, just the way I am. You should be able to use them inside of LinqPad as well. It's the same type of environment for compiling. You just have to get all the DLLs that you need together, because you can't just add, for example, salesorder.dll. There's other things that you have to add in along with that, some of which are not readily apparent that you have to add. So just be aware of those things.
Fred, I have sample code, and I can give Nick a list of the references that are needed to make LinqPad work with business objects and do calls directly to Epicor.
All right. And from Kevin Beldman, apparently doing things as like a functional group saved him some effort with a product that we have called Quick Prints. We put them all inside the same library, so it was very easy for him to work with. And Kevin also asked if I've used functions with Power Automate at all, and no, I haven't. I honestly haven't explored Power Automate all that much, so a little out of the scope on there. If anybody else has. Hannah, have you done Power Automate and functions?
No, I've never used it.
Okay. Kevin says we're trying to make a Teams bot with Power Automate. Ah, cool. It's a good idea. Tim Shoemaker might have some input if you want to. We can put that into the Stump the Chump or ask Tim when he's here. And from Dan, I'd be interested in the info to use LinqPad to do BO calls as well. And Nick, side note, I use .NET Fiddler or .NET Fiddle to do quick code checks. Cool, Nick. We'll have to share that with other people. I've not heard of .NET Fiddle. I know there was a cool tool called Fiddler way back in the day. I'm just going to send that message off to everybody so they've all got the link there that you provided. Appreciate it. All right, I've got a few seconds left before I get to my time. Boy, howdy, I thought we were going to end early. And another person interested in utilizing BO and LinqPad. I'll see if, Calvin, if we can just get all that, we'll put it in the minutes. That way it's there for everybody too.